We are delighted to be joined by author Scott Christensen to talk about his brand new book, What About Evil? Hello and welcome to Exposit The Word, Scott.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, really good. Thank you for your time in joining us today. Before we get stuck into the questions, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a pastor, I'm a father, a husband. I've got 4 boys, and I've been an associate pastor at Kerrville Bible Church for about 1 year. I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary. Before that, I pastored a small church in Southwest Colorado for 16 years. And I'm a graduate of the Master's Seminary. Yeah. And I love the Lord, and I love to pastor, and I love to write books.
Yeah, so good. How did you become a Christian?
So I grew up in a kind of a fundamentalist Baptist church in Denver, Colorado. And I was one of those kids, during Sunday school class, whenever they gave an invitation to accept Jesus into your heart, I raised my hand every time.
Yeah.
And, I was scared I wasn't going to make it. And but I do believe at some point along the way there, my profession of faith was genuine. However, I wasn't in a very good environment to grow as a Christian. And but I had a broken relationship with a girl in my second year of college that really awakened me to the fact that I had not been following the Lord as I should. And that kind of sparked my interest in really growing in my faith. And from that point onward, I just developed a voracious appetite for God's word, for reading good Christian books. And ever since then, the Lord has just done amazing things in my life. So yeah.
Yeah. This book really follows on nicely from your last book, What About Free Will? Before we talk about your new book, What About Evil? Tell us about that first book and how it lays down the foundation for us to look at evil.
Well, so What About Free Will came out about 4 years ago, and it grew out of my own questions about free will when I began to embrace the doctrines of grace and Calvinistic perspective on salvation and election, predestination, and all these sorts of questions. And a friend of mine had introduced me to election. I never even believed that it existed. Didn't read my Bible very carefully, but I became convinced that God is certainly sovereign in the election of believers to salvation. But it still left me with questions about, well, how does our own will work into that picture? How does human responsibility? Is there any sense in which we have any freedom of choice in our coming to saving faith? And so I wrestled with those questions for a long time. And as I did so, I read a lot and kind of kept a running file of my thoughts until the thing got really big. And then I started to organize it a little bit. And then I did a series of messages on election from Ephesians 1 in my church in Colorado a number of years ago. And questions about free will came up from my congregation. And so I drew from some of my thoughts that I put together in that little file that I had kept stored away in my computer. And about a year or so after I preached those sermons and dealt with that question, it occurred to me that this would maybe make an interesting book. And so I went through the whole process of finding a publisher and wrote the book. And of course, I come to realize in researching the book that this question embraces a large number of other questions. And one of those is certainly the question of evil, and the question of moral responsibility and of God's sovereignty, of God as sovereign in our salvation, of God as sovereign over the whole universe, over everything that happens, if he providentially ensures that all things go according to his ordained plan for history, then how does evil enter into that question? And how is God remain free of moral culpability for evil? And how do we assign moral culpability to human beings if God ultimately determines our choices? Yeah. And so a lot of those questions are raised when you're dealing with the question of God's will and man's will, and what does all that look like? Yeah. And so I had to really deal with the question of evil in the free will book. And then after I completed that free will book, my editor suggested to me that I needed to write a full book just on the problem of evil.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's how the second book grew out of the first book. I dealt, somewhat substantially in the free will book on the question of evil, but not with any great level of thoroughness. Yeah. And he felt that I said a lot of good things about the issue in the free will book, and so he suggested I write this full book, and that was a very daunting task. And so for the next 4.5 years, I researched and wrote What About Evil? Yeah.
What attribute or set of attributes is the proper starting place when thinking about who God is?
That's a very good question. And, R.C. Sproul, as many of your viewers may know, has written a fantastic book called The Holiness of God. And one of the things that Sproul talks about when he defines the holiness of God is that we're really dealing with two subject matters. We're dealing not only with God's holiness in terms of his righteous purity, his perfect righteousness and justice and sinlessness and moral perfection, all of that is encompassed in the idea of God's holiness. But really that is a subcategory of a broader picture of God's holiness, which really speaks to his awesome transcendence. Theologians often make a distinction between God as creator and the creation, that there's this creator-creature distinction. And so that in the creator category, if you will, God is transcendent. In other words, he exists in an exalted place of glory and majesty and supremacy that is unique. In other words, some theologians use a Latin term called sui generis. This means that God subsists in a category all by himself. And so and often theologians will speak to this as God's transcendence. I think holiness in that sense is equivalent to the notion of transcendence, that God exists in this category of other. Now, he's not completely other, because God relates to us as human beings. He's created us within his image. And so God penetrates the finite realm of his creation through revelation, through his providence, and of course, ultimately through the incarnation of his son. But I think the starting place to really understand the character and the nature of God is that he is this transcendent other. He is holy in the sense that he transcends all that is common to the created realm. And I think that's really important to recognize that when you're dealing with the problem of evil, because too often when we think about evil and we think about God's relationship to evil, we tend to look at God as an exalted finite being. And you can't do that. God exists in this category of otherness, of holiness, of transcendence that places him in a unique relationship to evil that no creature can have. And so I think that, and I deal extensively with that notion early on in my book.
Yeah. Why has God allowed evil to come into the world?
So that gets really to the heart of my book, and that question, and I should back up a little bit. My book is not so much addressing the problem of suffering on the personal level and how do we handle suffering that may be the result of evil in the world. There's certainly a place for that kind of book, and there's many excellent books that already deal with that question in terms of bringing a kind of spiritual salve to the souls of those who suffer. That's not the kind of book that I've written. I'm trying to ask the broader question of why do we have evil in the world in the first place? And I seek to answer that question. And it is probably the most significant question, or the most significant criticism of the Bible, of Christianity in general, that has ever been leveled against the Christian faith. And so it is probably the most important question that those who seek to defend the claims of the Bible and of God's purpose in the world have to face this question. Every Christian really has to face it in one way or another at some point. Yeah. And so, so I really begin addressing that question by asking some very big picture questions. And I ask the question, why did God create the world in the first place? And if we understand who God is, we understand that God has no need to create anything. God is completely self-satisfied in his own Trinitarian being, and therefore has no need for anything outside of himself. He is fully satisfied in his own Trinitarian being. Therefore has no need to create the world, the universe, human beings, angels, anything. So the only reason why he would do that is because he freely chose to, out of his own freedom. But the question remains, why would he do that? Why would he create? Well, I think that the consistent answer of Orthodox theology throughout the years, as it reflects on this question from the Bible, is that God created the world so that he could display his glory to his creatures. And so God desired to magnify his glory to the creation. And so the question is, how did God do that? In other words, how is God's glory most magnified in the creation? And I think as Christians, we can only have one answer to that. And it is through the incarnation, the death, resurrection, and exaltation of Jesus Christ. Christ magnifies the glory of the Father in a supreme way that no other way conceivable could. In other words, we cannot conceive of a greater way that God's glory could be manifested to his creatures than through the incarnation, the death, the resurrection, and exaltation of Christ. And I try to unpack what all that means in the book. But then you are faced with another question. If this is how God is most magnified, his glory is most magnified, especially in the death and resurrection of Christ, what that means is that God purposed to magnify his glory through a work of redemption, through the work of redemption. And if God's glory is most magnified in the work of redemption, then it presupposes that something needs redeemed, that the creation needs redeemed, that creatures need redeemed. And if creatures need redeemed, that means that they had to have fallen from a previous state whereby redemption was not necessary. And so my argument is very simple. The reason why there is evil in the world is because it created conditions for which God could magnify his glory in a supreme manner. And God is most supremely glorified in the death and resurrection of Christ and everything that attends that, which implies the incarnation and his exaltation and eternal kingdom that will go on forever and ever and ever. And that all of that presupposes that there had to be a crisis in which Jesus, as the great protagonist of history, the great hero of history, came to solve. He came to solve this crisis, And by solving that crisis in his death and resurrection, he magnifies the glory of God in a way that could never be magnified had the fall and the necessity of redemption had never occurred. So in other words, you can imagine the storyline of history would be Adam and Eve placed in the garden, and they never sinned. They existed in a state of moral perfection and in harmony with their God, walking together forever and ever and ever without any possibility of falling from that position. God could have created the world in such a way. There's nothing that would suggest to us that God wouldn't have created a world or couldn't have created a world that way. And in fact, most people ask the question, why didn't he? Why did he allow the fall to happen? Why did he allow the serpent to slither into the garden? Why did he even place this command to say you can eat of all these trees except this one tree? And why did he prevent any of that from happening if he is a sovereign God? Well, because he had a purpose in it. He had a purpose in seeing the world come to this place of crisis, of humanity falling into this curse, of the creation itself being cursed, in order that he might magnify his glory by sending Christ in to redeem this world and redeem a people for himself, so that his glory would be magnified in a supreme way. And there's no other way, I believe, that God could supremely magnify his glory except in that scenario. And so that's the short and dirty answer to the question, why is there evil? It's all about Christ. It's all about the work of redemption that he came to achieve.
What does it mean that God is sovereign?
So if we survey scripture, and I spent some time, several chapters surveying what this question entails, and I think we discover, particularly in Isaiah, I encourage people to read Isaiah chapter 40 through 48, because those chapters in the book of Isaiah are really a kind of apology or defense of God's sovereign glory as the transcendent and sovereign God of the universe. And I think by looking at those chapters, and of course other passages as well, obviously, we see that God has decreed or ordained everything in history. For example, if you look at Isaiah 46, God speaks and he says, "Remember the former things long past. I am God and there is no other." There he's already talking about his transcendence. And he says, "I am God, there is no one like me," right? He's saying, I exist in a category all by myself. Okay? Declaring the end from the beginning. In other words, God is saying, this is what the end will be like, and this is what the beginning will be like. This is what Bible scholars call a merism, the beginning and the end, which doesn't mean he's just talking about the beginning and the end, but everything in between. So God has already declared this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen in the beginning, and this is what's going to happen at the end. He says, "And from ancient times, things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I've spoken. Truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it. Surely I will do it." So there's several things that he is saying there. First of all, he's saying, I have planned it. I have ordained it. I have decreed this is what's going to happen. Everything from beginning to end. I've decreed it all. Plus, I will ensure that it happens in the actual unfolding of history. So you have not only God's decree, what he has planned. So he is not only the architect of history, but he's also the one who builds history. He's the one that actually makes it happen. And so this speaks of God's providence, right? He governs the universe, and he uses secondary means to do that. So things like the laws of nature are just simply God's manner by which he governs the universe. Or when it comes to the choices of human beings, he uses our desires and intentions and will as independent human beings, as finite creatures made in the image of God. He uses our choices to accomplish his ultimate ends, his good purpose, as Isaiah says. So yeah, a lot to unpack in there, but I think that's a good, succinct summary of what the Bible means when it speaks of God's sovereignty.
Yeah, wow. This is so awesome, Scott. Amazing stuff. What is theodicy, and why is it important for Christians to develop a theodicy?
So theodicy is it's a fancy word that was coined by a German theologian / philosopher named Gottfried Leibniz. And he was from the early 1700s. And he was the one that coined this phrase theodicy, and it comes from two Greek words. The Greek word for God, which is theos, and the Greek word for justice, which is dike. And so you throw those words together and you get the word theodicy. And it means, well, literally it means justifying God. And so the question is, how does one justify God's ways, God's character, God's being, God's purposes in the face of evil? Okay, so, and this is the question of how do we defend the claims of the Christian faith that says that God is sovereign, he is all good, he is all powerful, and yet evil exists in the world. So you have this trilemma. You have these three conditions that we see with regard to God and the world that seem to pose a problem, right? So theologians believe that God is all powerful. And interestingly enough, both Arminians and Calvinists believe this, right? This is a misnomer when people say, well, Arminians don't believe that God is all powerful. They believe he is all powerful, but they say that the Arminian will say that God chooses to limit his power in order to respect the free will of his creatures. Therefore, he will not interfere with the exercise of their free will. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems with that, and that's why I wrote the book Free Will. Yeah. What about free will? And I deal with those questions also in this book as well. But anyway, the point is that historically Orthodox theology has embraced that God is all powerful and he is all good. He is all benevolent, right? So if you have a God that is perfectly good and perfectly sovereign, perfectly powerful, then why would he allow evil in the world, right? And so this is a problem because we know there's evil. And as Christians, if we know that God is all good, he is all powerful, and yet there's evil, one of these things doesn't fit. Either we know evil exists, but most people don't deny that evil exists, right? So if evil exists, then it seems to put into question whether or not God is all good, because we assume that if God is all good, that he would use his all-powerful nature to stop evil or prevent it from happening, but he hasn't done so, right? So maybe he's not all good. Maybe God, maybe as Christians, maybe God himself is claiming that he is good, but that's an empty profession, because look, there's evil in the world. Surely no good God would allow evil. Okay, or perhaps God is all good, but he's not really all powerful. Maybe he really can't stop this evil from happening. This is actually the position of the famous Rabbi Kushner, who says, "Why do bad things happen to good people?" And he basically argued. He said, "I can't believe in a God who is not all good. I have to believe in a God of love. I have to believe in a God of all benevolence. And therefore, because there's evil in the world, I have to conclude that God just can't stop it from happening. God is not powerful enough to prevent evil from happening or stop it once it has happened. Well, no self-respecting, Bible-believing Christian, no matter what theological position you hold, can go down that road, because the Bible does not allow us to go down that road. God is all-powerful, and he is all good. Therefore, we have to address this question of evil head-on.
Yeah. What is the difference between moral and natural evil?
So moral and natural evil are distinctions that theologians make with regard to the question of evil. Moral evil has to do with evil deeds that are done by moral creatures. So if we look at who are moral beings, broadly speaking, we can say God is a moral being and he is marked by moral perfection. But we also have finite creatures that are part of God's creation that are also moral beings. So in that category, you have angels and demons, and you have human beings who are created in the image of God. And so these beings are moral in nature, and therefore they have a moral constitution by which they make decisions of a moral nature for which they are culpable. Another way of putting it is that God has placed moral demands upon his creatures, and therefore we have moral obligations to abide by those commands, and those commands, those moral commands, reflect the very character of God himself, right? And so God demands that we be conformed to his very moral character. But the fact is, we have fallen from those commands and have placed this curse upon human beings, in which Adam's sin has been imputed to his whole progeny, to the entire world, and therefore we are under this curse. And this curse means that not only are we born in sin with a sin nature, what theologians call original sin, but we also willfully engage in sinful acts that defy who God is. And so that is moral evil.
Yeah.
Now, we learn that as a result of this moral evil, or a result of the fall of Adam and Eve into evil, resulted in the world itself being cursed. In other words, the inanimate creation that is not moral in its constitution. Nonetheless, it exhibits characteristics that bring suffering into the world. So that, for example, in this cursed world, because of moral evil, because of Adam and Eve's sin, now we have things like disease and decay and pain and suffering that mark our world. And so tornadoes and earthquakes and coronavirus and COVID-19 and all these things are the result of sin permeating a world and bringing a curse upon it. So we wouldn't say that an earthquake in and of itself is morally culpable for the pain and suffering that it brings in the world. It's simply the result of a world that's been cursed because of moral evil. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. What does the Bible say about God's goodness, and why is the all-encompassing goodness of God so important when thinking about the problem of evil?
Well, I've touched on this a little bit already. We have to, it's one of those datum points that we can't deviate from. The Bible is very clear. The Apostle John says in 1 John 1:5, he says, God is light and in him is no darkness at all. Right, and darkness is used there as a metaphor for evil. So that, and light being a metaphor for God's perfect holiness, his perfect righteousness and justice and so forth. And so no darkness can be found in God, right? David tells us in Psalm 5, he says, for you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. So when we speak of the goodness of God, we're speaking of his moral perfection, of his benevolence, and he displays that benevolence in what theologians call common grace, right? God reigns on the good and the evil alike, right? He gives good gifts to men in the form of all kinds of things. He allows us to even live, right? It is his mercy and his goodness that allows any human being to continue to live any moment of their life. And so we see God's goodness in that. We see it in creation. We see it in just the simple pleasures of life. These are all parts of God's goodness that he displays to all human beings. Of course, he displays a unique kind of goodness to those whom he loves in a very special way, those whom he has chosen to redeem, has chosen for salvation and to display the wonder of his glory and his grace through the work of Christ in his death and resurrection. Yeah. And so all those things are very important when we understand that God has this all-encompassing goodness about him. And it tells us that since that is a non-negotiable datum from which we must understand the very character and nature of God, any kind of evil that enters into the picture cannot in any way undermine God's goodness. And since God is also sovereign and all-powerful, it must lead to only one conclusion, that God can only have some good purpose for evil. In other words, and I make this distinction in the book, there's no such thing as what some philosophers call gratuitous evil. So the word gratuitous is a term that means something that has no purpose, something that is meaningless, right? And we can come up with all kinds of instances of evil that seem to us as human beings to be gratuitous, right? You think of the Holocaust, you think of, for Americans, you think of 9/11 and the thousands of people that died when the Twin Towers came crashing down. And we think of those things as what good thing could come out of that? What good purpose could God have in allowing that to happen? And so for most human beings, we're thinking, I can't think of anything. I can't think of what good purpose there might be in seeing a little girl raped brutally. Really? What good could come out of such a thing? And so we gravitate toward the notion that there's evil in the world that's gratuitous, that has no good purpose whatsoever. But I don't think we can go down that road, because once we go down that road and saying that there are gratuitous evils, that means that God has allowed certain evils to come about that have absolutely no good purpose whatsoever, that they cannot generate any goods at all. And I think that would place a serious blight upon the character of God. We know that God has prevented certain evils. For example, in the worldwide flood of Noah's day, he stopped evil from going, like there was a threshold that God said, evil can go this far, but no further. Right? We see the same thing in Sodom and Gomorrah. And anytime God's judgment comes upon a people or a nation or a person, he's basically, it's an indication that he is preventing any further evil from taking place in many of those cases. And so God clearly has already stopped much evil from happening. So any evil that he permits or allows to continue must have some good purpose, or he wouldn't allow it to happen. And so, we can't imagine any evil that God doesn't have a good purpose for. Now that raises another important question, and maybe this is one you would ask. But the question then is, well, can we know what all those purposes are? And the answer is no. We can't know. In fact, in most instances of individual cases of evil, we may never know what God might be doing or what good purpose he might have in any particular instance of evil. In the life of Job, it's interesting that you have this conversation in heaven between God and Satan, and Job seems completely unaware of that conversation. And when Job brings his case before the Almighty and says, I will set my case before him, and I will get him to answer me. I will get him to tell me, why has all this evil befallen me? Why has my family been wiped out? Why has my health been wiped out? Why was all my possessions just taken away from me? What did I do that would cause this to happen? Well, of course, we know that Job was a righteous man, and there was no causal connection between any sin that he had and the loss of all these things that belonged to him, including the lives of his children. And so he asks God the why question, right? We all ask these why questions. Why, God, why? Why have you allowed this to happen? God never gave Job an answer. Well, he did give Job an answer.
Yeah.
He said to Job, and this is just a way of summarizing Job 38 through 41, basically says, I am God and you are not.
Yeah.
Right? And where were you when I did this and I did this? And he speaks of his wonderful works of creation and providence. And basically he says, I have a right to do as I please, and ultimately it will bring about my good purposes. And you may never know exactly what those are. One of the things that God obviously did, that he did reveal to us through the inspired author of Job, is to display to Satan that Job would maintain his integrity and would not curse God in the face of evil. And that was true.
Yeah.
Job never cursed God. He questioned God, but he never came to a place where he rejected and cursed God to his face. And he worshiped him and honored him in the end.
Yeah.
And then God, of course, honored Job in the end as well. But he didn't have to.
Yeah.
And so in many cases of evil, specific instances of evil, we may never know what God might be doing. But we know overall that any evil that God does allow is ultimately to magnify his glory in some way or another, and ultimately to magnify his glory in the work of redemption.
Mm-hmm. How can God be responsible for ordaining evil without being morally responsible for it at the same time?
So that raises another very important question that we need to deal with when we're dealing with the question of evil, and that is moral culpability. So there's two questions that have to be asked. How do humans remain culpable if God is sovereign over the evil that occurs that they themselves actually do? And we see several instances of that. For example, just a very, very popular or very well-known incident is, in the book of Exodus, where we read that God hardens the heart of Pharaoh, even as Pharaoh himself willingly hardened his own heart. Basically, you see there what my pastor likes to call the twin towers of God's sovereignty and human responsibility, right? And they come together there. So God hardens Pharaoh's heart, but that doesn't undermine the fact that Pharaoh himself simultaneously is hardening his own heart. And he is completely unaware that God actually stands behind the hardening of his heart, right? Which has a purpose, right? He entrenches himself in resistance to let Moses and his people go. Why? So that God will continue to press against him and bring these plagues, and plague after plague after plague. Every time each plague happens, Pharaoh hardens his heart and entrenches himself even further, when most people would relent and say, okay, let him go. No, he doesn't. And why does he do that? God specifically says, so that I will be glorified in your midst, and you will know that I am Yahweh.
Yeah.
Right? And so he is going to magnify his glory in these amazing, miraculous, destructive events that decimate this nation and bring about deliverance for his people Israel.
Yeah.
And imagine the story if Pharaoh had said, okay, I give, I let people go the moment Moses and Aaron first came to him. Well, we'd never hear about that story.
Yeah.
He let, oh yeah, there's a little, couple of verses in the Bible about Israel were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And then Moses confronted him and he let them go and off they went. No. That's not the story. A crisis took place, a massive crisis that brought about great evil and pain and suffering for God's people. But then God delivered them through these miraculous series of judgments that precipitate this grand deliverance that from there on out has become a kind of paradigm for God's miraculous deliverance of his people. And so it dramatizes history, it dramatizes God's work in the world in a way that magnifies his glory as no other way could do that.
Yeah.
And so nonetheless, getting back to the question, I'm kind of getting off topic here. The question is, where does moral culpability lie? It lies in the intentions of one's heart, right? Jesus says in Matthew 15, he says, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander, and so forth, right? He says, out of the heart come these things. In other words, it is out of the intentions of the heart that evil desires come. And so evil in Scripture is always connected to one's intentions, whether they be good or evil. Okay. Now, this comes into a powerful resolution, for example, in the story of Joseph, right? And we know that Joseph's brothers, right, the patriarchs, sold Joseph into slavery. They did an evil deed later on in the book of Genesis. They acknowledge that we shouldn't have done this. We did wrong to our brother, and they're fearful of Joseph because now he's the prime minister of Egypt, and they're afraid that he's going to exact revenge on them. And when they come in this face-to-face meeting and they're shaking in their boots, and Joseph says to him, "Don't fear." And he says, "I know that you're feeling bad." I'm summarizing here. I'm paraphrasing. I know that you're feeling bad. You're feeling guilty about what you've done to me, but I want you to know that it was God who sent me here. In other words, it was God who determined that you would sell me into slavery and do this evil deed. So later on, he summarizes the whole thing when they come before him, and this is Genesis 50:20, a very key verse in the Bible. And Joseph says to his brothers, he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. It's a very, very important verse in Scripture because it very clearly indicates that it is the intentions of the heart that ground our moral responsibility. For Joseph's brothers, they intended evil. They only had evil intentions in their hearts for selling him into slavery. But God, who superintended that same event from his transcendent sovereign place over the universe and over the lives of these men, he intended that same event to happen, but not for evil, but for good.
Yeah, wow.
So God can only have good intentions for the evil that he ordains. Humans can only have evil intentions for the evil that they engage in.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a mystery there because we can't fully make sense of that, but that's because we're now dealing with the transcendence of God, and he stands above the plane of our finite understanding in ways that we can't grasp. And as a sovereign God who is perfectly holy, perfectly good, he can only have good intentions for any evil purposes that he does. In the case of Joseph, it was to, again, magnify his glory through their deliverance from famine and to establish them as his people and preserve them for future generations.
Yeah. Scott, amazing. What an amazing interview you've given us, and what an amazing book you've written. Have you any closing thoughts, and how can people keep up to date with you, Scott?
Well, people can follow me on Twitter or Facebook if they want to. My Twitter handle is at Pastor Scott C. And they can follow me on Facebook by going to Facebook and going to at Pastor Scott Christensen, CHRISTENSEN. And I've got Facebook, and they can follow me on Facebook and Twitter or Parler. Parler is a newer social media platform, and you can go to at Pastor Scott C if you're on Parler as well. Those are the best ways to keep track with me. Yeah.
Brilliant. Have you come over to MeWe yet?
Not yet. I've been hearing about it.
Yeah.
But maybe one of these days.
Brilliant. Before we go, Scott, have you got anything else that you'd like to just leave the listeners with before we go?
I would just say that many Christians have been overwhelmed with trying to understand evil, and I hope that they would buy my book. And it is a thick book. It's a lot of material to digest, but I try to examine comprehensively all of the most pertinent questions that people have about the existence of evil and how this impacts our view of God, how it impacts moral responsibility. How do we deal with the positions of free will and what Calvinists believe and what is called compatibilism, the idea again of God's sovereignty and human responsibility. I try to address all these kinds of questions in the book, and hopefully in a way that's not too academic. I root my arguments in good academic sources, but I write at a level that I hope good pastors and educated lay people can really understand.
Yeah, brilliant.
So,
Scott, thanks again for your time. I'm going to put the links for your social media and for your book in the description below. Thanks, Scott. Hopefully you get a chance to catch up with you again sometime.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.